I chose Walt Whitman because his poetry openly embraced expressions of affection between men, which made him a significant figure in 19th century America. In class, we discussed Whitman's history, how he was born in Long Island in 1819 to poor parents and 8 siblings, and though he left school at 11 years old, he was literate and worked as an office boy, and soon after started writing articles and publishing poems by the age of 16. We learned that at age 36, he published his first edition of Leaves of Grass and how it shocked and scandalized some readers due to its openness about sexuality. We saw that Whitman's poetry had celebrated the idea of comradeship between men, subtly hinting at a form of queer identity without explicitly using modern terms like gay or homosexual, which didn't exist in this time. We also talked about how he volunteered to care for Civil War soldiers after learning that his own brother had been mildly injured. It was there he began to take a more melancholy tone in some of his work. It was after meeting Peter Doyle that Whitman, inspired by his love for him, decided to remove 3 of his more melancholic poems from his Leaves of Grass collection. They remained in contact over the years until Whitman's death in 1892. Through my own research, I have found whitmanarchive.org, which contains the complete archive of Walt Whitman's poems. In particular, his Calamus poems, which were a series of poems within his larger work, Leaves of Grass, explored deep emotional connections between men and desire for intimate connections that are not bound by the expectations of the world at that time. For example, in Paths Untrodden, it states, "In paths untrodden, in the growth by margins of pond waters, escaped from the life that exhibits itself," which is often interpreted as his longing to step away from societal norms and walk his own path of affection and desire. In another poem called We Two Boys Together Clinging, it read, "We two boys together clinging, one the other never leaving," describing a deep bond between 2 boys, using language that suggests both emotional and physical closeness. There's also Song of Myself, the poem we read for class, in which Whitman explores identity, emphasizes the body and physicality, and contains erotic undertones. These poems and many others show how his work often challenged the boundaries of heteronormative relationships by celebrating intimate bonds between men. Whitman's literature contributed to a queer literary subculture, offering a form of expressions for same-sex love, thus paving the way for later LGBTQ artists and writers. While Whitman is celebrated for his exploration of male affection and queer identity, it's important to acknowledge the controversies surrounding his relationships with much younger men. One of his most well-known companions, Peter Doyle, was a man about 30 years younger than Whitman. Scholars have examined this relationship closely, with many viewing it as a deep emotional bond, and some suggesting it could have been romantic or sexual. It's important to approach this part of his life with historical context. In the 19th century, relationships between older men and younger men often existed within different social dynamics than they do today, sometimes as mentorships or deep friendships. Still, we must not ignore the power dynamics of such age differences, and it's essential to have nuanced conversations about them without enforcing harmful stereotypes, especially those that unfairly target LGBTQ+ individuals. Whitman lived in an era where open discussions of same-sex attraction were impossible due to societal constraints. By expressing these themes through subtle language in works like Calamus and Song of Myself, he provided early literary representations of queer identity. Whitman's use of comradeship and adhesiveness in his work reflects a broader desire to articulate relationships that defied the rigid heterosexual norms of his time. This helps us understand how queerness existed and was expressed long before modern labels such as gay or homosexual came into common use. His poetry became a precursor to later queer subcultures that emerged in the 20th century, showing that queer history stretches far beyond the 1969 Stonewall riots or contemporary movements for equality. It reminds us that queer expression has always existed, even if it wasn't always explicitly named. Examining Whitman also helps us understand the complexities of historical figures who lived in eras that were repressive toward queer people. Whitman navigated these constraints, offering coded expressions of queer identity, which speaks to the resilience and creativity of LGBTQ individuals throughout history. Although Whitman never explicitly identified as gay, his poetry suggests a self-recognition of his attraction to men. Through Leaves of Grass, Whitman explored intimate bonds between men, acknowledging an internal sense of desire that deviated from heteronormative expectations. Whitman cultivated close relationships with other men, like Peter Doyle, which reflected this idea of connection. In his poetry, he wrote about comradeship as a deep, emotional, and possibly romantic connection between men. These relationships, while sometimes controversial, contributed to Whitman's understanding of male affection and helped him build connections with those who shared similar feelings. Whitman's poetry is part of the foundation of queer literature. His work gave voice to same-sex desire and intimate male relationships at a time when such topics were suppressed. This provided a space for future queer writers and artists to explore similar themes. Leaves of Grass especially influenced later queer literary figures such as Oscar Wilde. Although Whitman's era did not see the development of the kind of LGBTQ solidarity we recognize today, his work laid the groundwork for future communities to rally around. His poetry, subtly advocating for love and affection outside of heteronormative boundaries, played a role in the early stages of building a shared queer identity. Whitman's legacy continues to inspire queer communities today, particularly in literature and the arts, as an early example of a figure who defied conventional notions of sexuality and identity.